Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Network for Justice's second annual Policy and Skill Building Convening Plenary, entitled Slave Patrols and the Expansion of Modern Day Policing. I am Angeline Fraser Giles, Executive Director of the National Network for Justice. NNJ supports and strengthens state-based organizations seeking to reduce jail, prison, and detention populations safely and permanently. Assisting me tonight with logistics is Program Consultant Essie Mathis. In thinking about tonight's presentation, I wanted to ensure that the historical aspects of how Black and Brown bodies are policed in our society is addressed. And I'm confident that our panelists tonight will do just that. However, before I introduce our speakers, I would like us to have a moment of silence to remember all those that have been lost due to mob violence, extrajudicial killings, and state-sanctioned violence. Please let's take a moment of silence to remember them all. Thank you. Diallo Brooks is Senior Director of Outreach and Partner Engagement for People for the American Way, or PFAW. PFAW and its affiliate, People for the American Way Foundation, are progressive advocacy organizations founded to fight right-wing extremism and build a democratic society that implements the ideals of freedom, equality, opportunity, and justice for all. Christopher Ervin is the founder of the Lazarus, Rite, Inc., a workforce development organization providing returning citizens with job readiness and skill certification, resulting in stable employment and a positive network to reconnect with their families and communities. LaTonya Goldsby is the co-founding president of the Black Lives Matter Cleveland chapter. The Black Lives Matter Foundation, Inc. is a global organization whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities. LaTonya is also NNJ's Cleveland Resist ORP/OL organizer, and you'll hear more about that a little later. And finally, Professor Hank Klibanoff is a veteran journalist and winner of a Pulitzer Prize in History for The Race Beat, The Press, the Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation. He directs and teaches the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory and is the creator and host of the podcast Buried Truths, one of my favorite podcasts, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diallo, and then we'll go down the line and have each person give us just some brief comments about what they do, why they got into this work, and what their thoughts are about slave patrols and now our present day law enforcement policies. So we're going to start with Diallo Brooks.
Well, Angeline, thank you first for inviting me to participate in this policy discussion. I'm excited to be here to have this conversation. It's a very important topic. My name is Diallo Brooks. I am now for People for the American Way and People for the American Way Foundation. I've been engaged in civil rights and social justice work for probably over 25 years now, and really working to make sure that communities are engaged in the fight for social justice and fight for a change in this country to protect all of our liberties and rights moving forward. This topic is something that I've paid particularly close attention to, one as a Black man, as a father of Black children, knowing how policing has been done in this country, the foundations of policing in this country. And I think, as we watch protests around the country because of Breonna Taylor, because of George Floyd, and the countless other folks that have been killed by police officers, we know all too well the story behind all of that. For far too long, our communities have been traumatized by the relationship between our communities and policing. And we know this because we know that policing comes from a place that was meant to keep Black bodies in line. We know that policing comes from a place where it was post-slavery, where we had free Africans in this country that were supposedly freed, but they had to set up systems to keep those free folks in control and in indentured servitude. And policing was a mechanism to do that. And so when we look at a system and we deal with policing as it exists now, we know that there's this long history of violence against Black folks, a targeting of Black folks, a surveillance of Black folks, of keeping Black folks in certain communities, and then also having negative impacts on Black folks in those communities while they were marginalized in those places. It's a way to keep folks down. And so we have to have an honest conversation about that if we are really interested in creating real change. I currently have been working on a policing project within my organization of really trying to reimagine public safety. What does that mean? And what does that mean for vulnerable, often victimized communities? And you can't have that conversation if you're not honest about where all of this has come from. It's not just a matter of reform. The system works exactly the way it was supposed to work. We look at how the grand jury system played out. It's set up for folks to make arbitrary decisions about our lives every single day without retribution, without being held accountable. And so we have to do the hard work of reimagining what safe and healthy communities look like. We have to do the hard work of understanding the true history. I mean, you know, we can't dwell on the past, but we have to understand the past in order to plot a better future for all of us. Oftentimes, people like to conflate police violence with the violence that happens in communities. But the violence that we see that happens in communities is often because those communities are underserved, those communities are marginalized, lack resources. Those resources are sucked out of those communities. And then you see the police on top of that already marginalized problem, communities that have exacerbated problems play out as policing is laid on top of those communities. And so we have to do the hard work of really having an honest conversation about what that should look like for our communities. What other communities that are not a part of our communities need to see in order for real change to happen. And you know, the protests on the streets are just the culmination of fear, a culmination of anger, a culmination of anxiety, the tiredness of folks of continuing to be in that situation. And so, like I said, as a Black man living in Washington, D.C., traveled all over this country, been in many different cities around this country, and I have witnessed it firsthand. I have felt it firsthand. I have understood the fear. Anytime you see a police officer, because whether you're doing any, you know, you're not doing anything wrong, but just going down the street and you see a police officer behind you, is late at night, a lot of thoughts run through your mind. And so once again, I'm just glad we're having this conversation. I think it's an important conversation to have. I think that, you know, change can happen, but we have to be very intentional about that. We have to all work together and create opportunities and spaces for us to realize that change.
Diallo, thank you very much. I really appreciate the intentionality, that it really does have to be intentional. And we'll come back to that a little later, because I really want to try to address whether or not we think that that's happening, the intentionality of it. And the other part that you talked about is being honest about where we are and how we got here. And I really want us to delve into that a little bit more. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Mr. Christopher Ervin. You are on the hot seat.
Thank you, Angela. Good evening to you and to Hank and LaTonya and Diallo, and to the people joining us on this. I'm actually very happy to follow Brother Diallo, because my thing is, as he said, the history and how we got here. And when we talk about history, is one of the reasons I started the reentry program that we have here in Baltimore. We do direct service. We train people largely known for having been formally convicted to get their CDL license. Intentionally, that is an economic opportunity for people who are largely marginalized from their access to the franchise, as we call it. But we're also an academic program. Our program, we get people in a classroom and we go into a little bit of a few different areas, such as political science and civics, because we want them to understand how we got here, their role within society as citizens or as former felons, and how this all plays into this democracy. And so with that newfound information and then an economic opportunity, their re-engagement to the franchise is different. And so when we get them in the classroom, we want to focus on how we got here. And so often in the conversation, we start from the fairly recent history of Jim Crow, and we talk about Black codes, often forgetting that prior to being Black codes, they were slave codes. And slavery and all of that. But before that, the establishment of this form of governance as it is today, this democracy, when it could have been an autocracy, a plutocracy, meritocracy, it was a democracy for a reason. It was based around a form of governance that gave all power and privilege to white male property owners at the time. And so this form of governance that goes back to and before the 5th century BC, was brought here to this new land. And when the question's asked, why is that? Is because it continued that cycle of giving all power and privilege to white male property owners. And so our thing is to start from the basics. What is it to be a democracy? To put the power of participation in the shaping of policy, the participation on juries, all of these forms of what we see today in our society were established in the democracy. And so when we understand what it is to be a citizen, when we understand the methodologies of marginalizing people through criminalization, that conviction of a felony, even again in the 5th century BC in Athens, Greece, this is where it all comes from. When people understand that, then they see these are the same people, again, formally convicted, the people who are impacted by policy, then understand that they can participate in the shaping of policy if they fight for the right to get that access, to regain that access to the franchise, whether it be through voting, through jury service, or any other method. And so I'm happy for the work that organizations such as NNJ and NACDL have done. And we want to continue. All of this is relevant. All of this is relevant in how we are seen as citizens or not. Me being here in Baltimore and remembering the issue of Freddie Gray in 2015. If we recall, he was initially chased because he made eye contact with a police officer, nothing less. And in that particular community, because they requested increased police presence because of the activity in the community, they deemed the area a hotspot. This is a term that's embedded in legislation, that once an area is deemed a hotspot, the Fourth Amendment protections are lowered. The Fourth Amendment standard is lowered. And so all of this again plays into, if we want to understand the environment that we exist in, how we are governed in this environment, then we have to go back even prior to the slave patrols and how they were shaped up. Who was the citizen? Who had the power and privilege attendant to being a citizen, and who did not? Even in Athens, Greece, the citizen had all the power and privilege versus the slave women and children who did not. And that remained consistent right onto these shores. So I'm happy to join you all. I'm hoping if there's some questions, I'm good to go. You know, I will eat up some time. but I'm trying to be cognizant and respectful of our fellow guests. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And I think all of you could probably eat up time. Like this hour will go by very, very quickly because all of you bring such a breadth and depth of knowledge about these issues. When you talked about Greece, I remember I visited Greece. I was lucky enough to go to Greece prior to COVID, long years ago. And I had been working for a criminal justice organization. And so I knew the term draconian. And it wasn't until I got to Greece that I really understood it more, the root of where that came from. And so I appreciate you bringing up Greece, because who would have thought draconian? That's where it comes from. It comes from, from the Greek society and how devastating the leader was that was putting these policies in place. And I know there's a more history that you could probably give me on that. So I will just leave it at that, and you can expound on that a little bit later.
Next, I'll remute myself now because I was about to go in.
Step back just for a minute. I'll let you come back in on that. I'm gonna turn it over now to Ms. LaTonya Goldsby. Hi, LaTonya. How are you?
Hi, Angeline. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you all tonight. This is such an important conversation that, we often sometimes don't get the opportunity to have. So just a little brief history of myself and my chapter. My name is LaTonya. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Our BLM Cleveland chapter was started in 2015 after the murder of my 12-year-old cousin, Tamir Rice. Before Tamir was murdered, there were several incidents of police brutality or police violence, what we like to call police murders, that took place within our city. To start that off, it would have been in 2017 with the case of Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams, where several different police departments ended up in a high-speed police chasing their vehicle after their car had backfired, and the police assumed that they were being fired upon. So they end up chasing their car into another district, which ended or resulted in 137 shots being fired into the vehicle, killing Timothy and Melissa Williams. After Timothy and Melissa was murdered, there was the case of Tanisha Anderson. Tanisha Anderson was a Black female who was experiencing some mental health issues, and her family called for help and assistance with their loved one. And when the police arrived to the scene, ultimately, Tanisha ended up dying as a result of police being called to intervene in a mental health issue. Then after, I want to say 2 weeks, maybe, after Tanisha was murdered, is when Tamir Rice, 12-year-olds, were playing in a park with a toy gun. Police rolled up, and within 1 second of them arriving, Tamir was shot and killed. And through that trauma, that's how I began to organize within our community. Shortly after Tamir, the grand jury decision came down in Tamir's case is when our chapter actually formulated in response to the grand jury's decision not to charge officers Timothy Loman and Frank Grimbeck with his murder. So we've been actively in the streets, advocating for police accountability, advocating for the changes in the ways in which officers are prosecuted, the ending of qualified immunity and binding arbitration through union contracts. It has been our focus for the last, I want to say, 6 months. Just recently this year in April 9th of 2020, 22-year-old Desmond Franklin was also murdered by Cleveland police. An off-duty Cleveland police officer spotted these two young men. I guess supposedly the allegation was that they stole a pop off a truck. And in the process of the officer seeing this take place, some words were exchanged and what have you. And then the next thing we know, the officer shot through the window past a passenger and shot Mr. Franklin in the head, killing him. That case is now pending investigation. The slow dragging process that we're all familiar with before these things end up into the hands of the grand jury. That's where we are here in Cleveland as it relates to police accountability and making sure that we change the ways in which these officers are prosecuted.
LaTonya, thank you very much. And I thank you for a number of reasons. Primary, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit later also, is the trauma that communities are facing and the trauma that families are facing and the trauma that you're facing as someone who's in this work, doing this work, who had a loved one that was violently taken from them. And so I thank you on behalf of course, the whole panel, but the country, because we all were just in shock when we saw the video of what happened to your cousin, and recognizing, taking that moment of silence in the beginning was for him and so many others. So I thank you, and we will talk a little bit.
Thank you.
And I'm going to move now to Professor Hank Klibanoff, and Hank is going to share some things with us, and I think some audio as well.
Good evening. It's good to be with you. This is a great distinguished panel, and it's an honor to be with you. So I teach at Emory University. It's a second career for me. I was a newspaper reporter for many, many years in Mississippi, at the Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, and my last job was managing editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And I really, the time was right to leave after about 35, 36 years. And there was an opportunity here at Emory University to teach here. And I made a pitch to them. And part of the pitch, there was a chair there here. So part of the pitch was that I wanted to create an opportunity for students to study unpunished racially motivated murders in the South, and how they were influential on history and history was influential on them, for the opportunity to achieve justice where it could be, where there were living perpetrators, but also to achieve another kind of justice, even if there weren't living perpetrators, and that is the judgment of history. That is, I think there's profound clarity in history, and we have let too many people, and they were mostly men, African-American men, but not all, die, disappear, and die is too gentle a word, be killed, be murdered, disappear, and nobody know anything about it. It might have made it in the black press, something that would have happened in 1948 or 52 or 56, but the white press wasn't paying attention, and I dealt with that in The Race Beat, my book. So I had this idea, and Emory, to their credit, bought it. And before long, I connected with another professor here, Brett Gadsden. He was here at the time. He's now at Northwestern. He was African-American Studies and History. And we decided to create this course together. And it's a blended course. It was sort of classical history, which he is, and journalism, which I am. And we started just examining some cases. The first case that well, without going into all of them, after we'd been doing this for a while, I was approached by the CEO of the local NPR station here, WABE, Wanya Lucas, and she said, what can we do together? And she had heard from one of my students who was interning with her, how I spent my weekends going into small towns looking at cemeteries because I'm looking for headstones to try to locate the remains of people. And so she said, we've got to do something together. And next thing you know, we're working on a podcast together, Buried Truths. And so we've done 3 seasons. The first season was about a man named Isaiah Nixon, who was killed in 1948 because he voted. Killed by 2 white men he grew up with, who didn't like the way he voted. The second one, I'm oversimplifying, you know that. Those same family of white men beat up the head of the NAACP that same day. Second case was about A.C. Hall, 17-year-old Macon kid who went to a teen club in Macon. This is in October of 1962. A man who lived not too far from him had just released his first big hit, These Arms of Mine by Otis Redding. And it was a time of in Macon that Black music had always been strong, but was emerging, moving from rhythm and blues to soul. And I can just imagine AC and his girlfriend on October, I'm not going to tell you the date yet, in October 1962, meeting at a club, which they did, and then going for a walk. And as they're going for a walk, they get toward this middle school where AC had gone to school. And they're just standing there. They're probably hugging. He's 17, she's 16. Her friend later said to me he was her first true love. And all of a sudden, these headlights come up on them, and it's a police car. And what has happened is that some 20 minutes, half hour before, a white woman has seen that a Black man getting out of her car, she says. She goes and she notices a gun is missing from her husband's car. She and her husband called the police. The police, all white police, come by and say, well, do you think you'd recognize that colored man? And she said, yes, I think I can. And police say, get in the car, which is, absurd. Let's go get in the car and go look for a man walking around with a gun he stole, right? And that's when they come upon AC Hall, and she says, that's him. And AC starts to run. And the police start to shoot. In fact, one of the policemen, when he was at the coroner's inquest, he said, I was shooting to the left side, just pulling the trigger fast as I could pull it. I wasn't hardly aiming, just pointing the gun at him and firing. And AC Hall was shot and killed. They claimed it was self-defense, and we do in the podcast, and this is one reason I love the podcast, you can just stop the action and say, let's talk about self-defense. You heard about it twice in the Isaiah Nixon case. You heard about, now you're going to hear about it with AC Hall. And they said, yeah, it was very much the Laquan McDonald. They said, as he's running, it looked like he turned and was facing us and had a gun. And so we shot him. And guess what? This goes to a coroner's inquest, all right? 5 white men. They were all, this is 1962. They're all born in the 1800s, okay? And they're listening to testimony. And they hear that the medical examiner come in and said, I don't know if he was turning because he was shot dead in the back, okay? And the police officers, and by the way, they never found a gun, or they found a gun, but it clearly came from an evidence locker and it was, from a German gun. It wasn't this man's gun. The guy whose gun was stolen said, that's not my gun. Remarkably, the police, let me tell you what the police privilege was. And this all comes out in our research. And it was a great opportunity for us to educate people who listen to it. It was great education for me. And it's going to lead up to a moment I'm going to play you here. In Georgia, if you can believe this, police privilege was so written into state law that if you were a police officer and you were accused of virtually any crime, you got to go into the coroner's inquest and hear all the testimony against you. You got to go into the grand jury and hear all the testimony against you. And then you got the last statement. And guess what? You got that last statement without being sworn in and without being cross-examined. And it explains why police walked again and again and again and were never charged by grand juries, okay? In this case, even those 5 white men said, these guys have got their stories so confused in that quote, I'm firing as fast as I can, they said, in our opinion, it was murder. But it's a coroner's inquest. They weren't able to bring charges. It still had to go to the grand jury. Well, these are the kinds of things we find. And that's where we bring in the slave patrol, the behavior of the police as a metamorphosis from the slave patrol. I did it again in the 3rd season, which was about Ahmaud Arbery. I'm just going to play you a little bit of a moment here, if you don't mind. And somebody nod as to whether or not you can hear it once it starts.
To see that more clearly, let's look at the roots of policing in the South.
If you dig into the history, you'll find that many rural police departments began as slave patrols, white men whose mission was to catch runaways, to quell dissent, to inflict punishment. And this goes back a long time, back to the 1700s. Many of them brought ruthlessness, brutality, and dogs to the job. These slave patrols evolved into rural police departments and sheriff's offices. By the end of the 1800s, Reconstruction had fallen apart. The federal government had abandoned its mission to help former slaves become full, self-sufficient citizens, and the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise. In the early 1900s, you couldn't tell policemen from Klansmen because many of them were. And then came the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 60s. Who enforced these statutes of segregation? White police officers and sheriff's deputies. If you were a black Southerner in the early 1960s, it took very little imagination to connect the modern-day policeman with the olden-day slave patrol. It was the same man. For 200 years and more, white men with unquestioned authority were responsible for enforcing white supremacy. Listen to the voices of African Americans who lived in Macon in 1962 and who still live there today. Ollie Mae Hutchins, Eloise Franklin's friend in later life, talks about A.C. Hall's decision to run from the police.
But back in those days, if a police came at you and you didn't run, they were going to shoot you anyway, so he would try to get away.
Another Macon resident, Herbert Denard, does not recall knowing A.C. Hall, but he knows, as well as anyone, the Macon that A.C. Hall grew up in. He was born there in May 1945, 13 days after A.C. Hall was born. He founded and for 32 years edited a newspaper, the Georgia Informer, aimed at an African-American audience in and around Macon. He talks about the police of the 1960s in pretty stark terms.
If you go to the police, you're going to get beat or locked up or sent to the penitentiary. That was it. They didn't just take you and, oh, we're sorry, we made a mistake. You can go home now, we're sorry. No. You're going to get beat up, you're going to get shot, degraded, made you lay on the floor. If a woman was with you, she was going to lay down, they're going to look at her and have her take her clothes off and do all kind of things. And they would never be charged.
These were not isolated sentiments. Every black person we spoke to who lived in Macon in the 1960s said the same thing. You ran. I want to say one last thing about A.C.
Yes,
Hall, if you
please.
don't mind.
Yes, please.
He was shot and killed on the streets of Macon on October 13th, 1962. In 2 hours, it will be exactly 58 years since that occurred. This is October 13th, purely by serendipity that we're doing this on the same night, you know. And my students went down there and did an enormous amount of research. We were there several years ago while doing the research for the course and then podcast on reenacting their walk that night of October 13th, about 16 students, in order to experience the best we could all these years later, something akin to what he might have experienced. So that's an introduction to what I do with my students, and then what I've sort of spun off into this podcast, Buried Truths.
Hank, thank you very much. As I mentioned in the beginning, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I love podcasts. And I found Buried Truth. I don't even know how. I was just looking at Think Black History or something. I put in the search engine and this came up. It is mesmerizing, and I really just thank you so much for your work and your students' work. And it definitely helped in terms of me putting this together and thinking about slave patrols and how they were developed over time and how the present day policing is. And you know, one thing that Diallo you talked about is not really coming to terms with it and really being intentional and being honest about how we got to where we are. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about how, in your discussions about this project that you're doing, have you had discussions with, because you're in the DC metro area, have you had discussions with the police departments there and the powers that be, the mayor, about how we got to this place now and where we are?
So I'll say this, I mean,
Aspects of it.
yeah, I mean, you know, for the work that we're doing at the organization, it's on a national scale, so it goes beyond Washington, D.C., and have had conversations with a variety of experts and folks that are a part of systems, elected officials. For me, you know, being honest and looking at the accountability and looking at the structures and looking at how we create change, it's a process of deconstructing what's already in people's heads. It's a process of just deconstructing everything that we've been told about who police are and what their responsibilities are for our communities. There's a reality that sits in for us as Black folks that are impacted directly by the behaviors of those police officers and behaviors of the systems that continue to oppress communities. But that reality doesn't necessarily spill out into the majority communities beyond our communities at times. And for me, you know, as I've been looking at this whole process, I mean, you know, I think the Color of Change did this piece on how the media plays into our perception of policing, and meaning like how mass media, movies and films, you see the Dirty Harrys and you see all of these films, all these TV shows where police officers are allowed to behave in certain ways because their behavior leads to a safer community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those things are things that have been ingrained in us. So you go from the historical stuff that Christopher mentioned to the ingrained behaviors that come out of that. So how do we deconstruct that? Who has a role and responsibility for creating change? And then there's the intersectionality of the behaviors of policing and the larger public policy discussions that continue to exacerbate the problems that we see in many communities of folks that look like most of us, right? And so how do we not only just look at police officers themselves, but the systems that employ those police officers, the systems that provide power and rights for police officers to behave the way they do. And you know, we work with a lot of elected officials, and it's like, what is your role in this deconstructing a system of oppression that allows police officers to behave the way they behave? Police officers don't behave the way they behave currently if there's repercussions for those behaviors, if they're not allowed to behave in that manner. And we just deconstruct of what actually policing is, what police contact looks like. And one of the conversations that we've been having as we've been trying to put together policy recommendations, and we know the way the landscape looks, is that look at the amount of contact that happens between police officers and communities. Just simply contact. One, why are we having that contact? What behaviors are we trying to correct? And how do those behaviors play out? How do those contacts play out in those communities? And so how do we exacerbate, like police officers are trained to militarize and have a militarized approach to Black communities. Black communities are demonized. I had a police officer, I did a podcast recently with my sister-in-law. She does a podcast, and she invited me on with another police officer. And one of the police officers really talked about how you go to the academy and you have training. You can do all this de-escalation and all this other stuff. You come out of the academy, you sit in a car, a police car with a seasoned police officer. That police officer says your training begins now. Like, those are the mentality and the behaviors that exist. And that's just micro within the system. Deconstruct that even further and look at how we demonize communities for certain behaviors in ways that we don't demonize other communities, right? And like I said, Christopher hit the nail on the head when he talked about, like, you look at the history of what policing, look at the history of what citizenship means, and how we kind of flip the script and really take back control of citizen participation in a system where we are able to make decisions about what's best for ourselves and our communities. Technically, we think police officers work for us. But when I'm driving down the street and a police officer pulls me over for no reason because I'm Black and I'm in a certain kind of car and it's dark at night, there's no justification for that behavior, and my safety is not protected in that situation. Mm-hmm. I deserve public safety just like anybody else, but I don't feel safe, and I am oftentimes not safe in those situations. My behaviors are a response to that. My behaviors are being shifty or moving around or being nervous or, flinching. And my last thing I'll say is that if you really want to start comparison about how policing is done differently in different communities, watch a white woman come outside, argue with a police officer about whatever they're doing in their particular neighborhood, be irate, have a temper tantrum, and there's no escalation of that situation. But if you come into a neighborhood where I feel like I've been wronged and I verbally, and sometimes I'm not even irate, I'm just having a conversation with this officer about their behaviors and having conflict in what I see and what that officer sees, and all of a sudden it escalates into a place where I'm demonized and potentially my life is in danger. And then lastly, you have the officers that just strictly come in and look to light a fire because they point their cars in the direction of areas where they think there's going to be conflict, because in their hearts and minds, their job is to engage in conflict. They don't want to write tickets. They don't want to come in and, deal with, these little small issues. What they want to do is come in and have conflict. And the system is set up, it's legislated, like Christopher mentioned it, it's legislated for that conflict to happen. It is inevitable conflict that will happen because our systems are set up for that to take place. It is not set up for safety of Black and brown communities.
Right, thank you, Diallo. That is key, that there's that fear, and that a lot of Black and brown communities don't feel as if police are there to serve and protect because of the historical context of knowing, okay, this police officer, this slave patrol, this mob violence, and it's what we know, it's the historical part of it. And now here we are. And when you hear people talk about, well, we need to bring trust back, where was there ever trust, right, with the police? I want to quickly go to LaTonya, and one of the things that Diallo talked about was getting that training, right? Getting that certain training when you go to the academy, and then you come out and you're sitting in a car with a seasoned officer, and it's a totally different, game now, right? You're on the streets and you're learning on the job and you're doing things differently. In the case of your cousin Tamir, there was a situation where the police officer left one institution and came to another. And the other piece that I want to ask you about really quickly is having people look at our children, Black and brown boys, and seeing them as being older than they are. And because of that, they must be doing something wrong. And whatever it is that they have cannot be a toy, and immediately make that snap judgment. How do you get your mind around the fact that this happened, and how do you move forward with all of the policing that's going on? We talked briefly about all of the militarization, and Diallo brought this up also, that what's happening during the debate. And how do you rectify that? How do you come to terms with those types of issues?
Yeah, so when Tamir was first murdered, the police there was this whole thing of where he looked older than he was, or he was big for his age, and that just speaks to the demonizing of Black bodies that we see all the time, in these so-called stereotypes that they put on us. Um, the way we combated that was to change the narrative that the police department was putting out about Tamir. At the end of the day, he was a 12-year-old kid. He could have been anybody's 12-year-old child. I remember as a kid playing cops and robbers with my uncles in the backyard. So, you know, what he was doing was not something that was so far-fetched, like we've seen kids growing up playing who wanted to be cops, playing cops, so the way that we try to change that narrative is saying that, Timothy Loman was transferred from Independence, and in the process of his being transferred to Independence, Cleveland never took the time to review his personnel file from Independence. And it wasn't until after he killed Tamir and the investigation came out that they found out that he was dismissed from this prior police precinct because his performances as a police officer and his handling of a weapon was dismal. Him having emotional breakdowns on the gun range and things like that. And if Cleveland had did this due diligence and followed through in investigating this officer before they hired him, I believe that probably would have saved Tamir. I don't believe that no amount of training that these police officers get will change the culture of policing. It's just something that is embedded within the fabric of America. When we talk about the slave patrols and how the existence of current modern day policing came about, those folks that were back then were the sheriffs and the bailiffs of these towns and who are now the head of law enforcement departments. So when we talk about training, I don't think there's really any type of amount of training that will take that type of culture out of the mindset of police officers who come into these new positions of office and just following the trends or the culture that's already established within that department. Once you put on that sloop, that uniform, you are no longer a Black person or a white person. You are now blue. And that's how they operate. It's blue, no matter who. And that's the culture that they stick to, and they stand behind one another and they support each other, no matter if that officer has a history of police misconduct or has a history of using excessive force. You find it in situations where a lot of these officers are already familiar with this type of practice and they just go along with the status quo. So it's hard to find those officers. They say that one apple spoils the bunch, and I believe that's true.
Yeah, thank you very much. That had to have been a shock to find out that he was just moved from one place to the next and his record wasn't, looked at. And these are just the types of things that communities have to face all the time. And why aren't we doing more to ensure that there is public safety mechanism for all, not just for certain communities, as Diallo talked about, but for all? And why is it that our kids are demonized the way they are, regardless of what it is that they're doing? Immediately, it's immediately demonize them, kill them, and then try to figure it out later.
Yeah.
So I want to move really quickly to Christopher, because one of the things that we talked about previously was, when I say talked about, I mean he and I had these conversations about Freddie Gray, and where having Freddie Gray being killed in the way that he was again shocking. And because of the police surveillance and because of controls and because of the way that they police our communities, we ended up with a situation where it was just a mess, right? And you had the authorities coming in and trying to say, yes, we're gonna solve this and we're gonna figure this whole thing out. So could you talk a little bit about what you conceptualize as what happened, and then in terms of the consent decree, what came out of that, if anything came out? And I know this could be very loaded, so we'll keep it to a few minutes. We only have a few minutes left. So just talk a little bit about that. And if you want to go back to Draconian, you can talk about that for half a minute.
So I'll start with the Freddie Gray situation. The video is available on YouTube. Unfortunately, you know, I'm a photographer. I was there throughout all of that, the uprising that occurred after that. And so the pictures that I wanted to share, I can't because of my hard drive issues on my laptop. So just to go into it really quickly, what happened with Freddie Gray is initially, as he came out of the building, he was seen and then pursued by 3 officers. Those 3 officers took him down, and it led to what we now know the situation to have been. But those 3 officers were 3 white male officers. And that's significant to me because nowhere else do you see any other officers involved. There were 3 white male officers that took him down. But it came to, as the enforcement action progressed, and it made it into the courts, it was charged as 6 officers, 3 white male officers and 3 black officers, 2 male and 1 female, that had no physical contact with Freddie Gray or anything. What I want to jump to, if I could, is the enforcement action against police. And in the case of Sister LaTonya's cousin Tamir Rice, where was the lack of enforcement action? What happened to my screen?
We see you.
Okay. The lack of enforcement action, Zoom just went somewhere on me. I'm sorry, but I can see, there we go. Here's what I want to get to while my screen is trying to distract me. This must be important. Politicians shape policy that is enforced by the police. It's not just that they all those words happen to rhyme. It is based around the notion of the Greek city-state, the polis. And so when we're looking for when we're looking for an enforcement action against the police, we have to go back and look within policy to see if that action even exists. It really doesn't. The comparable, much like when you're buying a house, you got to know the comps. What are the numbers around here? If we look at the United States military, there is policy-based enforcement action against any military service person or contractor who might act outside of the policy. This is known as the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And so we'll see even recently, as pardoned by this president, a Navy SEAL, one of the highest operators in the United States military, who was court-martialed for actions in an active combat zone. Think about this. People in an active combat zone have to hesitate based on the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement also include escalation and de-escalation. We're talking about policy-based initiatives that do not apply to the police. When you look for something comparable in this parallel situation, we often talk about the police and we call them paramilitary, the Latin, like military. Well, where is the like policy of enforcement against these actors within their duties? And there is none. So the police are able to act in that function of slave patrols because of the one we have. Again, let's go back to when this democracy was established on these shores. What was the main concern for citizens? Native uprisings and slave rebellions. Native uprisings and slave rebellions, which is why this whole notion of the citizen having the ability to protect themselves. Yes, there were no police precincts. the backup, so to say, was so far off, the citizen had the right to do all of this. So once we get to all of these rights bestowed upon the citizen, and then the policy enforcers thereof who acted on behalf of the citizen. Politicians shape policy that is enforced by the police. And so when we are looking for policy against the, not against, but policy in restraint of the police, or to hold the police accountable, we have to look within policy. Even when we talk about the body camera policies, which we fought for here in Baltimore. I actually, proud to say, was one of the people kind of leading that effort. Because for me, someone who wore a uniform under policy in the Marine Corps, for me, someone who studied policy implementation, taking criminal law at the University of Maryland. For me, also someone impacted by policy as a formerly convicted person. I've been surrounded by policy. And so when it comes to how do we hold police accountable, we first have to have politicians in place who are willing to shape the policies that will hold them accountable. Body cameras, when we wanted to enact body cameras, that visual footage will act in the exact same manner as a written report. It can be redacted in the same way, but it will have the added advantage of not having the human bias built in. It will simply show what occurred. And so we also wanted to take away the ability of police to turn the camera off when they wanted to. Once it's activated, it should just run. And there's ways to deal with that. We got all kinds of pushback from the police union. These things don't exist in the United States military. These are comparables. The United States military and police are very comparable. And so on one side, where there's a chain of command that includes punishment from office hours and lower level enforcement, all the way up to and including general and special courts martial. This is why we know the name of Oliver North. But on the other side, when we look at police prosecutions, we rarely know the name of any officer above the level of patrol. We don't know who their lieutenant, colonel, major, we don't know who any of these people are. And they are never punished, not rarely, never punished for the actions of subordinates. I point to a movie such as A Few Good Men, Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson, Demi Moore. Everyone remembers the line, "You can't handle the truth." But the movie was all about the UCMJ and how Colonel Jessup was held accountable for the actions of a Lance Corporal who he did not know. It is the higher ranking officers that create culture that these patrol officers simply go out and execute. And with no manner of culpability over them, such as a UCMJ, these officers simply act to enforce the edicts given down by command who is acting on behalf of the citizenry. This Freddie Gray situation is so bothersome to me because the prosecution was executed in a manner that I believe was to not get guilty verdicts. And what I mean by that is where we have a police union, again, in the United States military, there's no union to protect military personnel from prosecution. There's a JAG court, a judge advocate general. There is that entire UCMJ, which punishes for everything from chewing gum in uniform to, again, firing inappropriately in an active combat zone. So there's all manner of punishments from top to bottom, whereas on the other side, there's nothing. We saw officers, again, that initially engaged Freddie Gray. And if you look at the YouTube video right now, he could not even walk to the van. So physically, something was wrong with him from the time they picked him up. And yet we saw 3 white officers that physically engaged him, charged with the lesser of all the crimes compared to the 3 black officers who drove the van, stood guard at the back of the van, and ultimately, in the case of Sergeant Alicia White, simply looked in, saw something was wrong, and called for the medic. What was most important? And when we just, the enforcement action against police has to be built into policy, which will only be done by way of us as citizens voting people into place who represent the positions that we hold, which is why the voter suppression part really starts even prior to going into the voting booth in a campaign season. It's how do I take away your ability to vote and be a part of this process that shapes this overall society that is enforced by police, those slave patrols.
Right, right. And we see that, good segue into the first season of what Hank was talking about, and some people voting, just voting, you could lose your life, right? And so when we tell people now the importance of voting, how important it is because people died for you to have that right, but then you have other folks trying to take that right away, and in many instances doing it if you in fact do have a conviction. How do you reconcile that? Thank you so much, Christopher, for that. And you didn't get to talk about draconian, but that'll have to be on another conversation, because as I said, this is going to be significant. Everything that you guys have all said, I really appreciate, and it's telling it. We can't just give it an hour, but that's all we could do right now. We'll have to have a part 2 probably. So with that, I'm going to leave the last word to Hank. Could you talk a little bit about this season of Buried Truths, because you did mention Ahmaud Arbery, and in the context of extrajudicial killing and the men who are charged with this crime, and from the slave patrol aspect of the community to where we are now. And you have about 3-4 minutes to do that, and we're gonna end there.
Right. Yes, thank you. The Ahmaud Arbery was a remarkable young man, and we studied his history. And he goes back into the Geechee culture in this nation on Sapelo Island, back to the original enslaved families. We've traced his genealogy all the way back to perhaps the most remarkable enslaved person on the Georgia coast, a literate Muslim who came from West Africa, then to the Bahamas, and was so highly regarded even by his slave owner, yet a slave owner, that he turned over management of the plantation to Bilali Muhammad, who went on to write a manuscript of 13 pages that confused modern day scholars. He, as we say in here, Ahmaud Arbery is tied to royalty among the enslaved, okay? And yet he could not run along the Georgia coast on his own without being chased, trapped by men and white men and 3 men in 2 trucks, and then killed, okay? So my point is that he as you'll hear a lawyer say on this, if anybody had a right to be running there, it's Ahmaud Arbery. And yet the men who killed him, they also go way back to the Confederacy. We looked at their roots and to slave ownership, okay? The man who first said, hey, son, let's go, was a former police officer who, we talked about training, okay? We hold up training as this great ideal, and we absolutely do want better training. We need radically different and better training. But what happens if they just don't take it? What if they just skip the classes? And that's what this guy did. Twice he was suspended, and his DA went to bat for him to get him the job back. Okay, the DA who then recused herself and wouldn't prosecute it. Okay, and he was just cavalier about the training. And so let me put it to you this way. Finally, when he finally has to leave policing, and of course they give him 4 months to get his pension and do all that at a desk job. He, on that day that he chases Ahmaud Arbery, having been stripped of his badge, stripped of his gun, stripped of his car, stripped of his position as a certified peace officer, he is doing on that day in chasing Ahmaud Arbery something he would not have been allowed to do had he still been a policeman. Okay? Yeah. So we got a broken system. I can't believe it doesn't need radical reform as to what policing should be. And I'm not talking defunding. I don't know enough about it to even talk about that, to be honest with you. But I just think
even
that
try
the
to get into that
concept,
discussion because it is a huge discussion. So
right, the concept of what a peace officer is, which is a police officer, needs to be radically changed, I think.
well, thank
You didn't
you.
ask me what I think, but that is what I think.
Thank you so much. So I'm actually going to privilege here and let everyone just say one thing that they want to get across really quickly, and then we're gonna end it. And I'll start with Diallo.
Yeah, just the one thing I would say is that we need to radically reimagine what not police officers look like, but what public safety looks like for our communities.
Thank you. LaTonya?
Yes, I would just say that if you are a city who is currently up under a consent decree and that consent decree is going to be ending soon, like our Cleveland consent decree is ending, it is imperative, very imperative, that we establish community oversight over policing.
Okay, thank you. Christopher?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my laptop is doing something special right now. For me, we do need to absolutely radically reshape what policy enforcement looks like in our society. But we also need to realize that reshaping best comes with our participation. The people in the communities, the people who are marginalized, the people who have been impacted by policy and understand these dynamics from the inside and not just from observing them. Much like whether it's the women's suffrage movement, as it should be, the immigration movement as it should be, the LGBTQ movement as it should be, their voices are brought forward to best impact any changes that their community would see. And so when we talk policing, we should most listen to people who have been incarcerated, who have been arrested, who have been beaten up, who have been impacted by policy enforcement, so that when we reshape policy, when we choose our politicians, we have people who have both our ear and our voice.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all again so much for participating tonight. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. I'm so glad that we recorded it for posterity's sake. And we have another day of programming tomorrow, starting at 1 o'clock. We're doing, strategic planning at 1 o'clock for our members. So thank you again for joining us. Thank all of my panelists so much. I really, really appreciate it. And have a wonderful night, everyone, and a good rest of your week.
Thank you, Angela. And it was a
Good night,
pleasure
everyone.
to see everyone. Have a good night.